Okay, welcome to Skyrocket Your Startup. Today's episode is with my esteemed guest, Jeff Cook, the CFO of ByteChek. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Appreciate it, and really glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, we here at Skyrocket Your Startup, I'm Amy Looper, the founder of Relativity Cells, and as we work with software companies across the globe, oftentimes we're working with companies in early stages, Jeff, that really they're handling a lot, and not only are they handling growing their business, but they've got to stay compliant and making sure that they're minimizing any kind of risk to the business. So I just am so happy that you're here because you are so full of knowledge in the areas of compliance, whether it be somebody going out and getting their assessment for SOC or any of the compliance frameworks. So are there any particular things, as we see a lot of talk around, GDPR, CCPA is certainly out there. Our companies that we're working with are doing a lot of marketing and a lot of focus around business development. Are there any trends, since those are such hot topics that people really need to think about?
Yeah, the one thing I've seen a lot, Amy, is that we're seeing this kind of trickle down effect in regards to compliance, right? Like compliance used to be something that a lot of enterprise size entities had to deal with, but a lot of small to medium businesses didn't really get into it that much. Now, what we've seen in the last 12, especially 12 months with COVID, but 18 months even, is these small to mid-sized businesses are being forced into, let's say, cloud environments, or maybe not even forced. Maybe they're just electing to go into more of a cloud-based environment, remote-based work, things like that. With that, though, comes some of this compliance effort, right? So a lot of their customers or maybe business partners are going to be asking about, let's say, like a SOC 2 report, or like you kind of mentioned, GDPR, especially if you're in Europe and dealing with European data, GDPR, things like that. And the reason we're seeing that is because these vendors, partners, customers, all of the above, are looking essentially at the core of protection of data, right? They want to make sure that their data is protected, that their supply chain is valid, and how they're protecting the data throughout the chain, et cetera. So that's what a lot of these efforts are coming from. And now, like I said, it's kind of trickling down to these small businesses, and they have to demonstrate how are they meeting these requirements of their customers, right? And what happens a lot of times, we get so many calls about this, is that customers will send an organization a 50-page security questionnaire, and they don't even know where to start with this, right? So a lot of times what they'll do is you can do that questionnaire, or you can get a SOC 2, for example, right? So that's where we're starting to see the uptick in these SOC 2s. AICPA came out a couple of weeks ago. I think last year there was almost a 40% even increase in SOC 2s last year from previous years. Yeah, so I mean, it's just exploding. But to even get to SOC 2, to get to GDPR, to get to HIPAA, to get to any of these, you have to really think about, again, protecting of data, right? And where does the data live in your environment, in your system? And then how are you protecting it? Are you protecting the access points? Are you protecting the actual external points, right? Are you protecting the people, educating the people who are interacting with the data to make sure that they're aware of security, things like that. So before you even get started in like any of these frameworks, you've got to think about those aspects of security.
Right. Understanding where your assets are. If a company's assets are completely in the cloud, I think it's a rarity where they're 100% in the cloud, but maybe the majority is there. Can they rely on their cloud provider to just be compliant for them?
Yes and no. Portions of it, yes. Like, so for example, let's just use AWS. It's everybody kind of knows who they are, right? If you're hosting your information, your application, your system in AWS, they're obviously responsible for the physical and environmental protection of data, right? You're in their data centers. You don't have to worry about that. That's part of the contract you're signing with them. The thing that you're responsible for, and this is where that shared responsibility model comes into play. The thing that you're responsible for is making sure that the access to the information is appropriate at your organization. So you have to make sure that the administrators in your AWS instance are correct in your company, that you don't have, let's say, open access points into the
Mhm.
AWS accounts. Or another example is S3. S3 is where a lot of the data gets stored in AWS. By one of the defaults, you might be leaving some of that data open. It's called an open S3 bucket. You don't want to
Yeah.
leave that open. You want to encrypt that, right? So you have to make sure that you're configuring the settings in AWS to where you need them to be to meet your security requirements. So that's that kind of shared responsibility model. So one of the questions, I do this all the time in my SOC 2 teaching, is one of the common mistakes that I have out there is that people think, oh, I use AWS, therefore I meet SOC 2. No, you still got a lot of work to do on your end to
Yeah.
meet security requirements and things like that.
And one part of the development team is, offshore somewhere, and maybe it is with like a third party. That's another aspect where a lot of software companies, I think, need to have a purview into not only being compliant, but secure.
Yeah, a lot of companies use offshore development, and that's totally cool. Like you can do that.
Mhm.
The thing you want to do with development environments is you don't want to use customer data, right?
Mhm.
So, or at least live customer data, or even I
Mhm.
would even say historical customer data. You should have basically dummy data going into those development environments, and then you have to segregate a development environment from production. So people should not have the ability. The developers should not have the ability to, push data from development to production. It has to be somebody separate that has that capability to make production live.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of sense. Awesome. How does ByteChek fit into the equation of compliance? What do you guys do?
Yeah, we do. So we've developed a tool that helps automate a lot of these processes. We started with SOC 2. You can probably already tell I know quite a bit about SOC 2. I'm a CPA. I help out the AI CPA with SOC 2 efforts, things like that. But we started with SOC 2 and kind of built a product that helps automate this process. So what happens is through these integrations that our customers have in the cloud environments, it can pull the
Yep.
data, let's say from an AWS environment or like a GitHub, a Jira, something like that, and
Mhm.
kind of tell, do you have the proper controls in place to meet, let's say SOC 2, to meet HIPAA, to meet CSA star, those kinds of things. And from there, it helps speed up the process for not only the assessment of the environment that you're having as management, but then it also helps the auditor because the auditor can see a lot more data a lot faster through these integrations. So the whole audit process gets sped up as well. That's a really
Interesting.
high level, 30,000 foot elevator pitch version of ByteChek. It goes into a lot more detail than that, but yeah, that's what we got going on. There's just, we knew there was a better way. This old
Yeah.
method of testing and the manual efforts was just getting out of date, and automation, like everything else, it's coming for these IT assessments too. And we found a way to help bridge that gap between organization and auditor, basically.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and companies that are, maybe they're 10 people, and they're just starting out, but they're scaling really rapidly. They don't have a dedicated resource to do these sort of things, right? So they've got to either hire a company but what if they don't have visibility? So it sounds like your platform gives them visibility before they get auditors involved and everything else where they may want to kind of clean up house a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. That's the beauty of automation is that, through these integrations, through, my co-founder, AJ Yon, he is
Mhm.
just a cloud tech guru, right? So he was able to configure a lot of these controls we have in our platform to where it's checking for those open S3 buckets, like I mentioned before.
Mhm.
And if we
Mhm.
spot that through the AWS integration in our platform, we're going to alert the client to that to say, look, you've got open S3 buckets. That's a security risk, and then
Yeah.
they'll be able to remediate that problem, right? So that automation helps with a lot of these young startup organizations who don't have a lot of resources to be able to fix those security issues. Let the automation do it for you. And if you spin up a new AWS instance, it'll check that instance too, right? So you'll be able
Yeah.
to continually be able to scale and grow, but at the same time, keep that security and compliance aspect to what you're doing. Um,
Mhm.
that's one aspect of it. I mean, the other thing is as you get more people in, making sure that they're following the security protocols that you want them to meet. That's where things The most common deficiencies we see in SOC 2 audits, or that I've seen in my history of doing them, is a lot in the HR functions. It's the onboarding and offboarding of personnel, because human
Yeah.
error is one of the biggest culprits of breaches out there, right? So maybe you terminate somebody and you forget to remove their access to this AWS instance or something like that, and that's
Yeah.
create a vulnerability. So having automation help check that kind of thing too. Also, like I mentioned, GitHub and Jira before, there's things like enabling branch protections, which helps scale as you continue to grow, because
Yeah.
a lot of times engineers tend to bypass, an SDLC, system development policy, and that's where you can have potential vulnerabilities too. Well, if you enable branch protections, that becomes very difficult to bypass anything. So this automation idea is not just to speed up compliance or to make lives easier. Of course it is that, but it's also to help the scaling processes as companies grow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's really good. I love your tagline, making compliance suck less.
Yeah. I
You
mean,
know?
it wasn't fun for anybody before. It
Yeah.
wasn't fun for the clients. They didn't want to sit there. The auditors knew it wasn't fun for the clients. So we just try to make the process a little bit easier for everybody.
Yeah, that's great. Well, since there have been so many vulnerabilities, I mean, no matter what sector that you're working in, I'm sure everyone has heard of all of the big cyber breaches that have happened over the last 18 months. Do you think that because there's been such activity, unfortunately, with incident response, will that have an effect on compliance regulations down the road?
I think we've already seen it in that we're seeing more of these requirements for, let's say, SOC 2 or equivalent reporting, where again, go back to the supply chain that I mentioned before. Supply chain doesn't just mean manufacturing and distribution anymore. It actually means anything in a cloud environment even. So a lot of these vendors, customers, et cetera, are doing their due diligence on these organizations because of the fact that it's been in the news for the last couple of years. And maybe even their insurance companies are saying, hey, you need to make sure you're doing your vendor management properly, which means making sure your vendors have proper security protocols in place for your data. Because let's think about this realistically. If you have, let's say you're a service, you've got your customer data, you're using a vendor who also is touching that customer data. Well, guess what? If they have a breach and your customer's data is the one that gets, breached, the customers are looking at you as the responsible party, and maybe the vendor too, but definitely they're looking at you. Why didn't you think about this with your vendor? So that's where we've seen those changes. And then when it comes to the things like GDPR, like you mentioned before, that's where we're seeing a lot more in the privacy aspects of it. So GDPR started in Europe. Then last year we saw California come up with their regulatory act, and now other states are starting to adopt theirs. So that's being very much in like who has access to individuals' data. How is that access being protected? If the individual wants that data erased, how is that happening? That's something that we're seeing changing, and that's something that gets pretty complicated. GDPR, when it first got implemented, companies were struggling with how do we find an individual's data if they ask us to erase it, things like that. So like you mentioned earlier, Amy, talking about assets and knowing where the assets are, super important, right? Because if you're ever going to go through that data mapping in order to meet these privacy regulations, that's going to be the starting point. You have to know the inventory of assets and where the data resides and where it transits.
Yeah, even if you've got guests coming to your website, right? That's now in purview of all of these types of audits. Are the auditors checking already? I mean, are they going into companies yet?
Yeah, it depends on what the requirements are, right? So a lot of companies will, for example, let's say if a company has a contract with a customer and the customer is saying, okay, you need to get a SOC 2 done on an annual basis. They're going to get a SOC 2 done, probably over security and confidentiality. Now, if they're not subject to GDPR, they're probably not going to undertake a GDPR assessment because it gets expensive, right? So they're still cost conscious of what's going on. So, however, if there are clients who are subject to these, which we do see more and more happening, especially at the bigger companies, and again, think about this trickle down, eventually it's going to happen to the smaller companies.
Mhm.
is they're saying, okay, not only do we want to see your SOC 2, we want to make sure that you are meeting the GDPR requirements. So what happens is a lot of times these reports, like a SOC 2, for example, will get paired with a GDPR assessment, meaning both are going to be done at the same time. Both have different end goals, but doesn't mean you can't test at once and help meet both reports essentially and do both reports. So we're starting to see, it's been going on for a while now, a lot of combined audit efforts. So you're doing
Yeah.
SOC 2 plus ISO 27001. You're doing SOC 2 plus GDPR, SOC 2 plus HIPAA,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
maybe it's all of those put together. So that's
Mhm.
what we're seeing a lot more of, is a combination of all these different frameworks.
That makes sense. That
Mhm.
makes sense. And what if a company just says, I just want to sell a product. I don't want to have to be, compliant. Maybe, maybe they're just starting out in healthcare, whatever the vertical might be. Like what is the cost and risk to them if they don't stay compliant?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about risk first, right? Like risk is a very big issue, especially there's a lot of insurance now that is saying you need to have certain compliance requirements done, right? And
Yeah.
the reason for that is because if again you get breached or your customer data gets touched, you're then liable, and you have a
Mhm.
potential balance sheet issue of a liability now that you have to pay out. So that's where we're seeing the risk, is that you need to have these environments set up properly so that you don't have that potential liability down the road. Now, when it comes to how are they dealing with that, again, the cost of dealing with it is not cheap, right? But the cost of having to deal with the back end of a liability on the balance sheet is a lot more expensive.
Yeah.
So I would always say it's almost very similar to insurance. You pay for it, but you hope you never have to really use it, right? But you're going to pay for security, you're going to pay for compliance, you're going to pay to be
Yeah.
more secure. But in the end, hopefully that makes you less likely to have an issue, right? Or
Yeah.
even if you did have an issue, you're more likely to catch it quicker and remediate the problem a lot quicker, right? To where
Yeah.
hopefully it's not a big deal. So typically, again, it depends on what framework you're dealing with. HIPAA is not as expensive as SOC 2, and SOC 2 is not as expensive as, let's say, GDPR, right? So it just
Mhm.
depends on where you're going. And also if you're using things like automation, right? So if, let's say, a traditional method, let me give you a quick example. Traditional
Yeah.
method in SOC 2 of doing change management testing. We talked about change management before.
Mhm.
Well, change management would be you get a sample, I'm sorry, a population of changes from a customer for an entire period. You sample
Mhm.
that population, you request evidence for those samples, you look through each piece of evidence, and then you make a conclusion or you ask more questions as an auditor. Now,
Yeah.
like I mentioned before, with these branch protections, it's more about, were the branch protections enabled? Were they configured correctly? Were they enabled throughout the entire period? If they were, don't need to do this big sample test anymore. So things like that are going to save time. But I would say in a first year, for people to budgeting purposes, it's anywhere
Yeah.
between, I would say, 25,000 to potentially $40,000 in the first year, because you have to.
Mhm.
The one thing that I always recommend people do, no matter what you go through, if it's SOC 2, HIPAA, whatever, do a readiness assessment, right?
Yeah.
Because that readiness assessment is going to be done by professionals who understand your end goal of what you
Mhm.
need to get to and measure you against that end goal of where you are today. And then you'll be able to see where you're deficient. So where are the problems you need to fix?
Right.
Fix those problems, then go down the road of actually doing the audit, because you don't want to have a deficient audit right off the bat. You want to have a nice audit off the bat. So do the readiness, see where you're at and what you need to fix. That's why in the first year, I always say it's going to be more expensive, because you're
Right.
going to want to do a readiness. You're going to have to spend time doing remediation, which is a cost of labor, right?
Yeah.
And then you're going to have to then do the audit itself.
Yeah.
So that's why it's a little bit more in that first year.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that perspective up, because a lot of early stage companies are also trying to figure out their funding and going to maybe angel investors, maybe VC firms. Are investors looking at those proactive steps in a positive way? Does it add valuation or a little bit more, oomph to the company?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things that I've seen is people, again, asking for a SOC 2. That seems to be a
Yeah.
very common one that's out there. But even the insurance side too, right? So insurance, they're going to want to see that you have cyber insurance. And a
Mhm.
lot of times cyber insurance is going to ask, what are you doing from a security point of view? Do you have a SOC 2 or what is your security protocols, things like that? They might do their questionnaire, or in lieu of the questionnaire, you could do a SOC 2. So
Yeah.
think about it that way. Like, even if the investing firm is not asking directly for a SOC 2, they might be asking about your cyber insurance, which that's asking for the SOC 2, right?
Gotcha.
So
Okay. Good to
definitely
know.
seeing a lot of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great to know. Awesome information, Jeff. Thank you for prepping us on all things compliance today. Is
Yeah.
there anything else that you'd like to mention about ByteChek or any upcoming news?
I mean, ByteChek, we're, like I said, we're all here to help with the SOC 2 process, and making SOC 2 a lot easier and make it suck less is what we're about. But we also do HIPAA. We also do CMMC. That's one we didn't really touch on today. CMMC, really quick, I'll just do a side note here. CMMC is very popular right now, getting big, because a lot of customers of the federal government might not have classified data, but they're still going to be subject to the CMMC rule. So
Yeah.
that's really, there's different levels of assessment of that. And this first level can be done a lot through the automation. So that's why we focused on it at ByteChek, because we can help companies get through level 1 very quickly. So CMMC, that's going to be there right now, and then ISO in this summer. So
Awesome.
cool.
All right. Well, we will make sure to think of you when anything compliance comes up, and we really appreciate it. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Amy. Appreciate it. Take care, everybody.